right. Our speaker is Dave. He is an independent iOS developer, and you may know him because he is the author of iOS Dev Weekly, which is a newsletter he sends out every single Friday with cool articles and posts and ways to keep up to date with iOS news. He also has a new project, the Swift Package Manager Library, which is a fantastic source for you to find some Swift packages. So, take it away for Dave.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Is everyone ready for the Apple event later? Yeah? We excited? So actually, I was looking at, when they announced the date of the Apple event last week, I was looking at the schedule for this conference, and I thought, well, I'm on from 9:45 till 10:15. And I thought, well, the Apple event starts at 10 a.m., so I'm going to get 15 minutes of your attention, and then everybody is literally either going to walk out or just be on their phone constantly. And then I remembered time zones. And as someone from the UK, you'd think I know about time zones because I'm already not on my native time zone. So yeah, I remembered about time zones and realized actually the event is kind of lunchtime. So I'm pleased to have your full attention this morning when I didn't think I would. And what I'm going to use that attention for is to talk about making your app feel at home on iOS 13. And what I really mean by that is something that you'll have probably heard about before, which is something called platform fit. Does the application that you write fit well on the platform that your users are using it on? So if you're writing an application for a desktop web browser, is it looking appropriate on a laptop screen or a monitor or something like that? If you're writing something for the Apple TV, does it fit well on a big screen? If you're writing something for Alexa, voice assistant, you know, the interfaces for those things are very, very different. And generally, most people get platform fit fairly right because it's difficult to get platform fit wrong. It's really obvious if the thing that you've designed is fundamentally wrong for the platform that it's being used on. What I'm going to talk about this morning, though, is something a little bit more subtle than that, and I'm going to call it feeling at home on the platform. For example, does your application take advantage of the features of the platform? Does it follow the design conventions that are set out by whichever vendor or person defines the conventions for the platform that you're working with? And this is where it's a little bit more difficult to get things right. So partly this can be difficult because, well, for example, if you're writing a cross-platform application, which many people do, if your application is literally the same, let's talk about iOS and Android. If your application is literally the same across those two platforms, it's hard to make it feel really at home on either of them because effectively you are having the exact same application across two different platforms. It also can be the situation where if you're, and this often happens with larger companies, if your company has very strong brand guidelines and colors and fonts and things like that, then it can make you fit in less well with the platform because you're following maybe corporate guidelines rather than platform guidelines. But to make your application feel at home is an important part of usability. And certainly, if you pay attention to it, then you're going to have a better quality application for your users to use. So let's go right back to the beginning. This is a screenshot of not even iOS 1, because it wasn't called iOS at the time. It was iPhone OS. I don't know whether you remember, but it certainly took me by surprise when I saw this screenshot. Do you remember the pitted metal dock? I'd completely forgotten that. I couldn't have told you that that was pitted metal. But this is iOS or iPhone OS 1. And the design of iPhone OS 1 set in progress a path of design that ended with this, which is iOS 6. So Apple were very much going down this route of this kind of design style, a lot of skeuomorphic design in there. Actually, one thing I noticed as I was putting this together, which surprised me, is if you'd have asked me before putting this together whether the gloss, you know, see on the iTunes icon and the App Store icon, the little kind of semicircular gloss on that, if you'd have asked me whether that got weaker or stronger from iOS 1 to iOS 6, I would have said it got weaker and weaker over time, right? But actually, if you look at these, it got stronger. The gloss is almost invisible there, apart from maybe on YouTube. It's funny how we remember things differently. I would have absolutely said that it got weaker over time. But certainly, the path of design was very straight from iOS 1 to iOS 6. And then this happened. So iOS 7 brought with it a complete redesign of the operating system. And it was such an enormous redesign that it's hard to remember back now just quite how that felt. But one thing that certainly struck me, I was in the audience when, at WWDC when this got announced. And I remember when the icons in that video came up, I distinctly remember thinking, I wonder why they've used placeholder artwork for the icons. Like, this must be beta artwork or something like that. And of course it's not. And you look at these icons now, with the potential exception of Game Center, which now looks out of place, right? But at the time, I remember looking at that Safari icon and thinking, this can't be real. It was such an enormous difference, and it's hard to kind of remember back to just how much of a difference that was. But of course, this now looks completely normal. And we'll probably today get a GM release of iOS 13. And next week, we'll probably get the final release of iOS 13. And again, that path of design has continued down a fairly straight path from iOS 7 to iOS 13. But that doesn't mean we don't get changes every year. And actually, the incremental changes that we do get really do add up. And you need to pay really good attention to what's happening in iOS design to really fit in with the platform. So the obvious stuff that's changed this year, I'm actually not going to talk about. So you might have been expecting some kind of talk on how to adopt the new modal presentation styles in iOS 13. The best place to learn about that is a WWDC video or the documentation or something like that. You might have been expecting a dark mode talk. Again, I'm not really going to talk about dark mode today. In fact, I'm not going to talk about it at all. You should adopt dark mode, of course, but the best place to learn about that is videos, WWDC videos. I'm going to talk about buttons today. One of the biggest changes when iOS 7 was introduced was that all the buttons suddenly started looking like this. And you might still, to this day, say, well, that doesn't look much like a button, because it doesn't really. It's just some text. There's no outline. There's no background. There's nothing around it. The only thing that indicates interactivity is the color of the text. And that was the standard that Apple put forward when they released iOS 7. And you compare that to iOS 6, just look how buttony that continue button is. You know, it maybe looks a bit old-fashioned now, but it's definitely a button. There's no question about it. On iOS 7, we've now got just some text, no outline, definitely no background color, nothing to really indicate that this is particularly tappable. So when iOS 13, where are we? Well, the good news is that these are some buttons from iOS 13. Background colors, borders. These look like buttons. This is great. In fact, even some animation on some of the buttons in iOS 13. So this is the new segmented control, and as you tap between the two segments, you get a little animation. So this is really, it's definitely not going back to the skeuomorphic iOS 6 days, but this is a huge step forward in terms of where we were with iOS 7 with its super thin fonts and completely undecorated buttons to where we are now. That doesn't mean we're completely done yet, because these are also from iOS 13. So there's definitely still a lot of those old style, or I'm calling them old style, iOS 7 style buttons in the operating system. So actually, I just started kind of going through and finding all the different types of buttons that I could until I ran out of space on this slide. And this is actually just from 2 different applications. This is from Maps and Reminders. And I just found an enormous number of different styles and, of buttons in iOS 13. So actually, as I was putting this together, I thought, well, there's a couple of different types of add button there, so let's see how many types of add button I can find. And these are all from first-party applications, so all Apple native applications on iOS 13. Lots of different types of add buttons there. There's even inconsistencies here around the capitalization on the word add. Some all caps, some capitalized. And again, another thing actually is 3 different weights of glyphs. So if you see the blue plus there, and then the black plus, and then the red plus, the glyphs are all actually different weights as well. So it seems like there's a whole load of inconsistency in iOS 13. And you're expecting me probably to summarize this by saying everything is inconsistent and badly designed and terrible. And actually, when I started putting this talk together, I kind of thought that was the conclusion I was going to come up with. But actually, the more I thought about it, everything's okay. And everything is actually really okay. So let's take a look at an example. This is the Reminders app on iOS 13. And there are 4 different styles of button on this screen. And then, just to trick you, there's one thing that really looks like a button, not a button. So getting in car, not a button. I'd say that's probably the thing that looks most like a button, but it's not. There are 4 different styles of buttons, though. There's the back button in top left. There's the ... button in the top right. There's then the button to check or uncheck whether your item has been done or not. And finally, there's the new reminder button right down at the bottom of the screen, nice and handy for the thumb, actually. So that's good placement for that button there, because this is probably why you're in this screen. Second reason you're probably in this screen is to check something off. So the fact that that new reminder button is right there at the bottom is a good thing. But why are there 4 different styles of buttons here? Well, the reason for that is that there's a hierarchy to the buttons on this screen. And not all of these buttons are equal. The back button and the ... button are less important than the other 2. Most people who use an iPhone, kind of general usage of an iPhone, probably make do with just one list of reminders. I think that's probably the majority use case. So going back to a list of lists of reminders is probably not something that most people do every day. So the fact that that lists button is de-emphasized compared to the 2 buttons that you might actually be here to tap, which is I did something or make a new reminder, it's okay for that to happen. In fact, it's good design for that to happen. The ... button. So the fact that there is a ... button is a thing in itself, and there is in fact, I linked to an article last week in the newsletter, which was about the prevalence of these ... buttons in iOS 13, and how it's very difficult to know what's behind that. But certainly all of the things that are behind that button are less important than the other buttons on this screen. So it's things like whether you are showing or hiding completed items in your reminders, that kind of thing. Less important. The 2 buttons that you're actually here to tick or to use, prominent, obvious, and actually I think that's great design. And what I did just for a bit of fun is I redesigned this screen to see how it would look if the weights or the importance of all those buttons was the same. And I think you'll agree that that is much more cluttered. It's not as clear what you should actually be drawn to there. And so consistency is really important, but consistency doesn't necessarily mean everything has to look the same. If we weren't being consistent with that back button across several different applications, that would be a problem. But actually, it's very consistent across all applications that back button is the same. Consistency is important, but it doesn't mean everything has to look the same. Let's talk about discovery. So discovery in iOS applications has always been challenging. Even after 10 years, mobile still feels like quite a young design environment, and the sizes of the screens that we deal with, especially on handheld devices like iPhones, there's not a lot of space to put descriptive text or help text or instructions on how to use something on the screen. And so what we've tended to do is fall back on this kind of thing. This is often what you'll see when you launch up a new application. And after you see this, then you'll see this, and then you'll see this, and then you'll get sold a premium upgrade. And it's not particularly the right place to do this, because so you've just downloaded an application from the App Store, and the reason you downloaded an application is because you wanted to use that application. So the first time the user comes into your app and you want to show them all the different features of your app. You want to show them everything that you've worked so hard to create, and not a single feature is unimportant enough not to be mentioned in this walkthrough. What the user wants is to just get in and use your app, right? And so it becomes like the swiping Olympics. Like, how quickly can I swipe through all these screens? I'm not going to read a single word of text on any of this. Or in fact, if there's a skip button, even better. Like that, I don't even have to swipe at that point. I can just hit skip. Who's hit a skip button on a screen like this? Every single hand in the room just went up, right? Me too. This is... Walkthroughs are not really that great for discovery. You have to think about where your user is, like what mood your user is in at the point where they launch your application. And like I said, they're probably there to do something. And we can be forgiven for doing this because we are not the only people who do this. In fact, in iOS 13, this is more prevalent than ever. And I think in every single first-party app in iOS 13, with maybe the exception of things like the phone app, you'll see this kind of screen. They don't always look the same. Some of them have monochrome icons. Some of them have colored icons. Some of them say welcome to something. Some of them say like what's new in something. But Apple are very consistent now with this kind of screen, showing either what's new or what they would like you to pay attention to inside the application. So it's not particularly confusing why everyone falls into this trap. If Apple are doing it, then it kind of gives us permission to do it as well. And at least with these ones, we don't have multiple screens. So Apple are very consistent with these in that there's always only ever 3 or 4 items. They're always very consistently designed. A what's new in at the top, 3 or 4, icon on the left-hand side, some text on the right-hand side. No swiping. You can dismiss any of these immediately. But of course, as soon as you dismiss it, it's gone forever. In fact, to take some of those screenshots, I had to wipe a device and reinstall it just so that I could take the screenshot again to capture those things. So there was some preparation went into this talk. Once it's gone forever. And so that's not ideal because, again, you're here to do something that gets in the way. In fact, the first time you use the keyboard on iOS 13, you'll get this in place of the keyboard. So this will cover up the keyboard. And it's teaching you about the new swipe keyboard, right? And there's a nice animation which is playing to show you how to use that keyboard. But if you think about what the user is doing when they see this, the most likely thing is that they're maybe sending like a iMessage or something like that, right? So they've gone into the application, they've tapped on somebody's name, the keyboard pops up, this is in the way, and they go, oh, that's not what I wanted to type a message. So they hit continue and they type their message. I bet if we, and this is the only time you'll ever see that. Once it's gone, it's gone. I bet the adoption of this feature is terrible because I bet most regular people who use an iPhone will never remember seeing that. They will all see it. Like I'm confident that it will be shown to everybody. Nobody will remember it. I think there was also a similar screen for the undo gesture in iOS 13. I actually don't really know what that undo gesture is because I probably dismissed it. I'm pretty sure I did see it, but I didn't yeah, I didn't notice it because I was doing something at the time. I was there to perform a task. So discoverability of the features of your application that block the user from doing what they were there to do is really bad. Now, there is some hope here, and especially around Siri, Apple are doing some really interesting stuff with discoverability. So this screen's actually been around for a few versions of the operating system now. You'll see this screen if you summon Siri and then don't say anything. After a few seconds, this pops up and it tells you some of the stuff that you can do with Siri. That's been there for a little while, and I think that's good. And Apple have really expanded on this in iOS 13. And you'll see lots of this kind of stuff all over the operating system. So that top one, top left, if you go into Messages, at the top of the list of recently used chats, you'll get this bubble that says talk instead of type. So I like this for a couple of different reasons. First of all, it doesn't get in the way. It's there at the top of the list of messages, but if you ignore it, you can scroll past it. In fact, it's not even obscuring any messages. It's just on top of the most recent chat that you've been having. You tap into your chat, you type your message, you go out. And if you weren't in the mood to learn something, that's okay, because next time you come back, this will still be here, right up until the point that you hit that X. At that point, it's gone. You'll never see it again. But that took deliberate action, and it wasn't the only option that was available to you. So I really like that. I was searching for something in Spotlight, and so this bottom left-hand corner one here, I was actually searching for settings, and it was just suggesting things like, you can use Siri to do this or that. And I love that, because I'm also not trying to figure out how to use Siri at this point. Siri is one of those difficult features that, because it's a voice assistant, there is no real UI. And so what they're doing is they're trying to pepper the discoverability of that feature around the operating system. And I actually think it's highlighting some really interesting ways to do discoverability inside your application. Constant reminders. Again, that right-hand one, if you're in Do Not Disturb while driving mode, if you try and swipe up from the bottom, which you shouldn't do. But if you do, you'll now get this really quite large thing that says, say, hey Siri, and it might be able to help you do something that you want to do, rather than unlocking your phone. And Apple are using this not only for Siri in iOS 13. So you'll see in the Health app, they are introducing new features like medical ID and cycle tracking. These are dismissible prompts, but they're not getting in the way. They're just there. They'll stay there until you dismiss them, but you can carry on doing whatever you were doing inside the application right up until the point at which you either decide to get started or hit the X to dismiss it, and at that point you'll never see it again. The other thing which I really like around discoverability in iOS 13 is contextual menus. So Peek and Pop is on its way out. 3D touching is on its way out. And instead, we've got long press for contextual menus. So long press on a picture or a video here, and you'll get a preview of that picture or video along with a contextual menu with all the different things you can do to whatever it is you're interacting with. And Apple use these all over the place. And I'd love to see third-party developers also adopt these as much as possible. Contextual menus here are very similar to right-click menus on the Mac. And actually, menus in general, not just right-click menus, are fantastic for discoverability. So on the Mac, you have the ability with the top menu bar, and also every time you right-click on anything, you might be right-clicking to copy some text, or you might be right-clicking to paste something or something like that. But actually, what you see is a whole set of menu options of what you can do. So you're not getting in the way of the user. The user is still able to do whatever they knew was behind that right click or behind that menu on the Mac. But they maybe discover something new that they can also do at the same time. And it helps to expose the features of your applications that people maybe didn't know about. And that's exactly what contextual menus can be used for. And I think these are fantastic for discoverability. Now, what we will need here is to make the long press and show a contextual menu, to make that something that users naturally go and do. And Apple are doing their part in that by putting these contextual menus literally everywhere around the operating system. We should also do the same, so that it just becomes something that people know how to do. If I am using my iPhone and I see something, I should know that I can long press it and I will see things that I can do with that item. And so I think there is actually huge steps forward in discoverability, despite it still being a difficult subject. And I think iOS 13, and especially the contextual menus, are going to really help us get there. So feeling at home on our operating system is about more than just adopting dark mode, which you should do. It's about observing the operating system really closely and taking direction from it. I've only talked about a couple of things today, and there's a huge amount more that I could talk about on this subject. But just from these two things that we've covered today, I hope that you've learned something about making your application fit in better with the operating system. Thank you very much for listening. Here's some of the places I can be found on the internet.